Okay, so we'll be looking at, Deleuze in this course, obviously in the context of international relations, but he's primarily a metaphysician. So he's interested in the first principles of things. He's interested in the fundamental nature of reality, fundamental nature of concepts, of identity, and all these different kinds of things. And we'll be looking at some of his metaphysics today, primarily because his metaphysical views and his views on politics are really deeply related, so you can't really understand one without the other. But they are quite tricky. He is a very tricky thinker. So my aim here is to give you a general idea about some of the most essential concepts in Deleuze's metaphysics, to give you this kind of broad brush understanding of his metaphysical system, so you can then have a sense of where he's coming from in terms of his politics. So in his magnum opus called Difference in Repetition, he tries to develop metaphysics that he considers adequate to contemporary mathematics and science. So in other words, he doesn't consider previous metaphysical systems to really support, to really capture or express the insights of modern science. So he wants to develop a metaphysics that does. And this is something that's actually quite interesting about him, because other post-structuralist theorists that we've looked at in this course, and who were actually contemporaries of his at the Sorbonne, so Derrida, Baudrillard, Foucault, all of these theorists, they tended to study and base their ideas on the metaphysicians such as Hegel or Heidegger. Deleuze, on the other hand, and given the context especially, was quite radical in that he focused instead on David Hume and the philosophy of empiricism. So empiricism is basically the view that all knowledge is based on experience that's derived from the senses. And this is, among his contemporaries in his context, this was not a popular view at all. So he was kind of a rebel here. Now, in his metaphysics, what he wants to do is he wants to replace the concept of substance with that of multiplicity. He wants to replace essence with event, and he wants to replace possibility or potentiality with the idea of virtuality. And you'll go through all of these in turn and hopefully give you a better idea of what he actually means by this. So the basic idea in Deleuze's metaphysics is the inversion of the traditional metaphysical relationship between identity and difference. So traditionally, difference was seen as derived from identity. So for example, if you say X is different from Y, then that means we have this relatively stable thing called X. It has certain qualities, and we've got this relatively stable thing Y, and that has also certain qualities. And we derive the difference between the two things by comparing these qualities and seeing what is not the same between X and Y, which sounds kind of pretty commonsensical, right? I mean, a trivial example like I've got here, we compare a carrot cake and a chocolate cake. So you've got this thing that exists, it's a carrot cake. It has a certain identity, it's made up of certain qualities. And then we have this thing with the identity of chocolate cake. It also has particular qualities. And we put these two identities, these two sets of qualities side by side. And then we look at the gap between them, what's not the same between them, and that's difference. So we have identity first, and then difference is the gap between these two identities, between the sets of qualities that things actually have. This, again, it sounds really commonsensical, but Deleuze wants to overturn this idea. He wants to make difference the primary thing and identity derivative of difference. So how does he do this? One of the key ideas for understanding the way that Deleuze overturns the identity-difference relationship is his concept of the multiplicity, and the way that his concept of the multiplicity rejects the theory, the philosophy of Platonism. So for Deleuze, and for Nietzsche as well, and for Henry Bergson, who Deleuze draws on quite explicitly to develop his own ideas, human beings and the human mind, it simplifies the world. So one of the reasons it does this, arguably, is because it's really useful for human survival, for human flourishing, if the human mind simplifies the world that it encounters. So for instance, let's say we're wandering through the forest and we need some food. We see a blueberry bush, right? Now the fact is that every blueberry on every blueberry bush is actually a singular thing, right? Every blueberry is just itself, and every blueberry we ever encounter in our lives is ultimately just it is itself. It's a unique, particular thing, right? In the real world, we never encounter the concept of blueberry. We never encounter, such a thing as blueberry in general. We encounter this blueberry or we encounter that blueberry. We encounter particular blueberries. But that's not how we think about things. That's not how our mind works. Instead, we apprehend this blueberry or that blueberry as a blueberry in general. And the reason why, arguably, is because this is really useful to us. We treat these quite unique instances as examples of the concept blueberry as reproductions or expressions, because this is just simpler from our point of view. It allows us to know that this blueberry and that blueberry are edible and they're going to provide us with some nutrition and so on. Because if our mind had to pay attention to and to understand every blueberry as the singular, unique, particular thing, then it would just be way, way harder to know whether we should eat it or not, right? So our mind imposes this order of concepts onto the world. And so we get this common sense belief that human concepts end up matching the things that exist naturally in the world. Now, Platonism, this is Plato here, as a metaphysical view of the nature of objects and concepts, codifies this common sense kind of view. So the basic idea with Platonism is that there's the one and there's the many. So the one is this fundamental, perfect idea of a thing. So there's this idea, there's this perfect concept of blueberry, and every real blueberry is just an instance of this, or a copy of this ideal, usually a bad copy of this ideal, an imperfect copy. It's an inferior copy of this perfect concept. So every blueberry is an instance of the idea of blueberry. Every blueberry is an expression of blueberry in general. And this kind of way of thinking about things kind of reassures us that the world around us is what matches the concepts that we use to understand it. Because it tells us that our own patterns, our own way of ordering things, our own way of making sense of things actually transcends the world. It's this thing that actually exists in the world, these concepts. But Deleuze is going to, he wants to say, no, this is not the world that we actually inhabit. We can't mistake our own concepts, these ideas, for something that actually exists in the world itself. We live in this world, he thinks, of manifest difference. We don't live in a world that fundamentally is ordered by concepts. That's something that we come up with. It's not something that is in the world. So there are only singular, specific blueberries. There are there's no such thing as this imperfect instance of the idea of blueberry. Blueberries, everything is just itself. Our world is then a world in which everything that we encounter is singular, everything we encounter is unique. And it only seems like there are these things in general because we impose that order on reality. It's an activity of our own mind. So instead of ideas, instead of concepts, instead of things in general, Deleuze describes the world as being made up of what he calls multiplicities. Multiplicities are made up of the relations between elements. So a particular blueberry is going to be a multiplicity. It's not this expression of a concept. It's not a model. It's not a copy. It's simply this combination of relations between things arranged in a particular way. Now, one thing I want to note here is that Deleuze is not saying that the idea of multiplicity simply draws attention to the fact that you can break things up into parts, because that's kind of obvious, right? And this is kind of a subtle but ultimately quite important difference. If we thought of things in that way, we've got this idea, we've got this thing, we've got a blueberry, and we think, okay, well, we can divide this blueberry up into various components. So we can have a blueberry. Blueberries are made up of X and Y and Z components. That, for Deleuze, is not what he means by multiplicity. And the reason why is because this way of looking at things presumes a unity from the start. So we begin with this idea of blueberry, and then we fragment the idea of blueberry into different bits. Right? So this is a kind of top-down way of understanding things as fragments. So we assume a unity, we assume a concept, we assume an idea of something at the start, and then we try to work out what components go into creating that idea or that concept or that thing. So we try to work out what perhaps what fragments in general make up a particular thing in general. So what we want to think about instead is multiplicity as a group of things in which there are certain determinate relationships possible between various things. Now, one way we can think about this perhaps is the idea of a set, or contrasting it with the idea of a set, because a set is always composed in relationship to something external. Again, using this idea of blueberries, we could have a set of blueberries, and we could put in that set everything that is a blueberry, right? But it's the concept berry, the criteria that determines whether something goes in that set or not, that is external to the set itself. That's not inside the set. Deleuze's idea of a multiplicity, by contrast, is not made up of a collection of things grouped together due to their being determined by some external concept. Instead, our multiplicity is made up solely due to the internal relations between the various components of that thing. So a set is made up of the things in that set, by whether or not a particular thing has a particular identity, a particular quality maybe, or a particular characteristic. But a multiplicity is just made up of the relationships between various elements. So there are certain principles, certain laws that determine the relations, or maybe the possibilities of relations between these elements. And it's these particular relations, or these possibilities of relations, of which a multiplicity is composed, and that determine the nature of a particular multiplicity. Okay, so what are the objects, what are the elements that make up a particular multiplicity? Well, for Deleuze, these two, these as well, they're not thought of as having a form or an identity or an essence. The objects, the elements of a multiplicity are themselves determined solely by the relations that they can and do enter into with other elements. So, in other words, the elements of a multiplicity just are those relations that they enter into with other elements. That is just what they are. As well as the relations that they could enter, that they have the power to enter into. So, in this context, it's the relations that's foregrounded. It's not the identity of a thing, it's the relations that a thing is entered into. So we're not saying there are things here, and therefore we've got relationships between these things that exist. Instead, we're saying there are relationships, and therefore there are things. So the things are derived from the relationships, not the other way around. So this is tricky, this is really hard because it completely flips around the usual way of thinking about metaphysics, our common sense view of metaphysics. In our everyday lives, we just think of identity coming first, and difference, the relationships between things, being derived from identity. But instead, in Deleuze's view, again, the relationships come first, the relations are first, and then what things are is merely the sum total of the relations that a thing enters into, either actually or virtually. And yeah, this is a really quite a heady inversion, I think. I think it's a really difficult thing to get your head around. Because we're just completely used to thinking in terms of identity. But this is quite key to Deleuze. This is really key. A thing consists of its relations. It isn't a thing that exists outside relations and enters into them. It doesn't have a particular form, it doesn't have a particular nature, and then enters into relations. It just is those relations. Whew, okay, so a multiplicity, then, it isn't a copy of a one, of this idea, of this concept. It's not an instance of a general kind. And, as I said, it's also not the idea of something being able to be divided, because a multiplicity is not made up of fragments, it's not made up of parts, because if it were, then we'd still be assuming that that thing has an identity before it's divided. So we'd already be assuming a unity, we'd already be assuming a whole, we'd already be assuming that it's in some way a copy of an idea or a concept or a thing in general. Instead then, a multiplicity is the relations of elements in what Deleuze calls a unique event. So this is what I was talking about before when I said that Deleuze wants to replace essence with event in his metaphysics. So traditional metaphysics, as I've mentioned, sees things in terms of categories and in terms of concepts. And everything that exists, therefore, has an essence. So if we're thinking about this in the context of international relations, we might think about the state, and we'd ask, okay, so what is the essence of a state, of the state as a concept? What is the state? What makes it what it is? What fundamental qualities make a state, rather than a multinational corporation or something like that, right? So everything that exists, a multinational corporation has an essence, a state has an essence, and the difference between them is that those essences differ. They have different qualities or sets of qualities that make up what they are. And this takes us back to the idea, I think, of identity and difference. Because when we think of things in this way, when we think in terms of essences, then we have two things with identity. We've got the corporation and the state. And we say, given their essence, given their qualities, given what they are, how can we tell the difference between these two things? And in this case, we're proceeding from identity to difference. But Deleuze, with his concept of multiplicities, he wants to throw out the idea of essence. He says there's just no such thing. Each individual thing that we call a state is not some unity. Every state is a multiplicity. It's in its singularity, not as an instance of a general kind, the relations between elements arranged in a particular way. And importantly for Deleuze, also not just in a particular way, but at a particular time. So, in other words, if there's no essence, if all we have, if everything is a multiplicity, then the world has to be made up of events instead of essences. So essences, they continue through time, right? A state contains the essence of stateness, and this essence underlies the particular state that we're talking about at any particular time, and this essence continues through time. So the state continues with this particular essence. So at moment one, a state is a certain way, and at moment two, it's slightly different perhaps, But at both moments, it still has this same essence. It still has the essence of stateness. If something is a multiplicity, though, then it's the relations between the various elements that matters. And these relations are things that occur at a particular moment in time. They don't continue through time. They occur at a particular moment. So if a particular multiplicity that we call a state is a relation of elements in a particular relationship at time 1, and a particular relation of elements in a particular relationship at time 2, then it's not the same thing at both times. So we have to think of multiplicity instead as an event, right? Something that exists and occurs at a particular time. It doesn't continue through time in a really simple kind of way. So a multiplicity occurs at time 1, a different multiplicity, though related in particular ways, occurs at time 2. Now this doesn't mean, of course, that a particular multiplicity that's made up of particular relations between particular things can't be relatively stable over time, but it does mean that you can only understand that stability in terms of the particular set of relations between elements, not as the stability of that thing's essence. Not the stability of a concept or a quality that embodies the identity of that thing over time. Okay, so this takes us to his idea, or his attempt to replace the idea of potential or possible with that of virtual. So if something has potential, in kind of a traditional metaphysical view, we usually think of it as having a particular quality. So an acorn, it has the potential to become an oak tree, for example, right? Because it has the quality of the potential to become an oak tree, possesses that particular quality. For Deleuze, though, this is just kind of a confused way of looking at things. And it's a method that can't really work, he thinks, in metaphysics. And particularly in a metaphysics, particularly in an ontology, in which identity is derived from difference and not the other way around. Because it's only when we're thinking in terms of identity and in terms of essence that we can assert that something has the quality of the potential to be Y. So an oak tree or an acorn has the quality of the potential to be an oak tree. The whole basis of this view completely trades on the reality of concepts or the reality of ideas, the reality of Platonic forms. It assumes that this stable thing over time with an essence that becomes this other stable thing over time also with an essence. Deleuze also thinks it just gets things the wrong way round. The idea with the acorn and the oak tree is that the oak tree exists in the beginning potentially in the acorn, and later it gains reality. So in the future, at the start it exists potentially, and later on it exists in reality. But Deleuze says when you really push at this theory, it kind of works the other way around. It doesn't work by addition. It actually kind of works by subtraction. So we have this thing that exists, we have this thing that has being, and then we subtract away that being, and through this subtraction we get the quality of potential being. So when we say that an acorn has the potential to become an oak tree, we're first thinking of an oak tree, then we're subtracting being from that oak tree, and we're attributing that oak tree without being to the acorn as a property. Or, to take another example, we could say, Jane has the potential to be a world-class cricket player, but what I'm actually doing here is I'm taking Jane as a world-class cricket player, as a concept or an idea. I'm subtracting being from that. I'm subtracting the existence of that, and then I'm attributing that lack to Jane, that potentiality to Jane as a quality. So I'm saying Jane has the quality of world-class cricket player without being or without existence. And that's, when you think about it, a pretty weird way of looking at things, right? It gets things the wrong way round, and particularly if we're trying to understand how things change over time. It's sort of, it's just working backwards. You can't explain change over time simply by taking the final state, subtracting being from that final state, and then attributing that as a quality to the earlier state. That's just lazy thinking, Deleuze thinks. You're not actually adding anything to that picture, you're just moving things around in a way that's actually not very helpful. And that's quite a strange way of looking at things, he thinks. So he rejects this metaphysics of possibility. He thinks it doesn't make sense on its own terms, and it's not really useful for a metaphysics of difference over identity and a metaphysics of event over essence. Instead, then, he replaces the dichotomy of possible and real with virtual and actual. For Deleuze, everything that exists, every multiplicity, has two sides. It has the virtual and the actual. The actual is the qualities or the extensities, so the extension in space, that an object has as a result of the current relations that the elements have entered into. The virtual, by contrast, that is the relations that could obtain between the elements. So given the current relations and the rules and the laws and the principles governing those relations, the virtual is all of the relations that the elements can enter into. Now, this may sound at first like it's a restatement of this idea of potential. It isn't. It's not it's not possibility. It's not potential, because possibility implies that something has a particular essence that contains the quality potential to be Y. The virtual is not a quality that a thing possesses in its essence. It's simply a different, or the different ways that the elements of a multitude could rearrange given the particular powers that they have. So it's ways that the internal topology of an object can rearrange in theory, in principle. So it's not about relations between entities. If it were, we'd be slipping back into this metaphysics of substance. In the virtual, it's the relational that's foregrounded here. It's about the ways that the internal structure of a thing could reorganize. Now, as I mentioned before as well, the virtual for Deleuze is a side of an object. So he wants to say that the virtual and the actual are actually both real. He's drawing their distinction in a different way than we would usually draw this kind of distinction. And the reason he does this is because given a particular internal structure, particular set of relations between elements, all the other relations that an element or the elements could enter into are actually part of that object itself. Not as a quality of the object, but as something that could arise from the current relations in theory, in principle, due to the powers that inhere in those relations. These powers, of course, are constituted themselves by the relations that elements have entered into, because remember, the relations come first and the elements come out of that. And again, this is quite a tricky point, but think of it maybe like this. Deleuze, he's privileging difference, he's privileging relations over identity. So he hasn't started with objects and then he's seen what relations they've entered into. He starts with relations, and those relations then constitute the elements of the object. And then those relations, of course, in constituting those elements, then constitute those elements with certain powers. So the virtual is those powers. It consists in those powers, the ways that those relations constitute the internal topology of an object such that it could rearrange because of the powers given to the elements by the relations that they've entered into. All right, so in short, a virtual is not the actual. It isn't the actual qualities or extensities of the object itself as a matter of fact, but the virtual is also part of the object because the relations of which the object is constituted could at any time rearrange to give rise, to actualize this virtual. Okay, so multiplicities are these objects constituted by internal relations between elements and consist in both the actual as well as the virtual relations between these elements. We can then divide multiplicities into two different kinds, and this is where it starts to get particularly relevant to international relations. You won't see why immediately, but we'll get to it. So he says there are continuous and there are discontinuous multiplicities. In the case of a discontinuous multiplicity, the relations between the elements of the multiplicity mean that change to that multiplicity consists in a process of division. So for instance, he would say a glass of water is a discontinuous multiplicity. A glass of water, it's homogeneous, right? Because if you divide a glass of water into two glasses, you get the same thing in both glasses. The water is the same temperature, it does the same things, it's basically the same stuff. You've divided the multiplicity then, but you haven't changed its nature, you haven't changed what it is. The relations between the elements of it remain exactly the same. By contrast, a continuous multiplicity consists in a multiplicity in which change to the relations leads to a change in what the multiplicity is or what the multiplicity does. So if you changed the relations between the elements of a human body, for example, you would change that thing. It would no longer be what it is. It wouldn't be a human body anymore. So for this reason, he calls continuous multiplicities heterogeneous, because they become different things depending on what happens to their own internal relations, their own internal topology. Okay, so there's no question here that all of this is extremely difficult. It's extremely challenging. I've published on Deleuze, and I still find him really, really hard. But I think the difficulty that people have when they engage with Deleuze actually speaks to why it's really important to look at metaphysics, even when we're studying something that's as seemingly distant as international relations. Now, I'm not saying here that the fact that something is difficult means that it's automatically worthwhile. That would be ridiculous. But I think it's worth thinking about why Deleuze's metaphysics are so challenging. And one reason, I think, is that we already have a metaphysics, right? We have the Platonic metaphysics that we just take for granted, that we just learn from our culture. We've picked up the Platonic metaphysics without even realizing it. And so when we encounter Deleuze's metaphysics, then there's this clash, right? It doesn't fit with our really basic way of understanding how the world works. But you can pretty much bet that Platonic metaphysics, right, the metaphysics that we take for granted, is actually just as complicated and just as difficult as Deleuze's view is. It's just that we've already learned this metaphysics, right? It's like learning a language, right? If you grow up with English and you try to learn Mandarin, then Mandarin just seems really difficult, really complicated. But it's no more complicated, obviously, than English is, because if you'd grown up with Mandarin, you'd think that English was the really difficult, really complicated language. So I think the difficulty in a metaphysics like Deleuze's here actually speaks to the way that at the most basic level, we have this taken for granted way of viewing the world, of making sense of the way things are. So our basic ways of understanding what reality itself consists in is something that itself is learned, like a language is learned. And I think it's pretty obvious too that your metaphysics, the way that you understand reality, what you think reality is, how it works, at this really basic level, is going to make thinking about some things, thinking about, let's say we're thinking about IR, possible or at least obvious. It's going to lead us to think certain ways about certain things, and it's going to actually preclude thinking about things in other ways. It's going to make certain theories possible and obvious, and it's going to make others unobvious. It's going to rule even some of them out of contention to begin with. They're just going to be completely ridiculous.